right, welcome. Thank you for coming out tonight. My name's Jackie Coe. I'm superintendent in SAU 24. And as most of you know, we are in the middle of budget season. You know, a 6-month process that begins in August, ends at deliberative session, and then voting in March. And we've spent the fall developing budgets, negotiating contracts, trying to identify school needs. At the same time, we recognize taxes are high. We all are getting our tax bills. And so the two things can be true. We have real needs in our schools, and taxpayers also have real-world need for relief. So I give credit for the members of the SAU 24 board for their desire to think about school funding at a systemic level. The plans for tonight came out of the board's desire to better understand issues like adequacy, state funding, the lawsuits, specifically how these all apply to SAU 24. So I really look forward to tonight's discussion, and I'd like to introduce Zach Sheehan and John Tobin from the New Hampshire Fair Funding Project.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I'm Zach Sheehan. I'm the Executive Director of the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project. First off, I just want to say thank you all for coming out on a Thursday evening to listen to this. Hopefully it's informative, and we really enjoy doing these all over the state. Before I get started, though, I just want to recognize how many folks here are from the SAU? Cool. How many folks are elected officials in any capacity? Handful of folks. Awesome. Well, thank you all for being here. A little background just on myself so you know who I am. I'm originally from Concord. I went to the public school system there. After high school, I got out of the state as fast as I could, like a lot of my peers. I wanted to leave. Didn't feel like New Hampshire was really a place for me. Despite my best intentions, I ended up back here a number of years after college and got involved with a number of different kind of nonpartisan advocacy issues, trying to expand access to affordable childcare for a number of years. Got to work a little bit at the state legislature as a staff member and see how that whole process ran. And throughout that, met a lot of people that were doing a whole range of different work, different issues in government, in the private sector, in nonprofit, in policy, just trying to make the state a better place to live. And I fell back in love with where I grew up, and now I'm back in Concord and have the privilege of working at this organization. We're a nonprofit organization. We've been around for about 3 years with paid staff, although as you'll hear from John when he jumps in, is an issue that has been going on for a long time at various degrees. And primarily what we do is twofold. We do a lot of education about education. So how does the system work? The presentation we're going to give tonight actually we've reworked it quite a bit. So you're the second presentation we've given with this particular slide deck, updated for looking forward to the next year, the 2 big court rulings. But we've given over 30 of these just this year. We go all over the state, talk to school boards, community groups, PTAs, teachers, and really trying to help people understand what goes into school funding and property taxes and all the different dynamics there. So presentation will take about 45 minutes. John and I will switch back and forth a few times. Plenty of time for Q&A. Do our best to answer anything we can. But again, just really want to appreciate everyone coming out tonight, and hopefully this is informative. So to start off, I want to kind of give a general review of where we're going with this, and then we're going to dive into a bit of an example. So at a high level, this issue, as Jackie lined up a little bit, is both about students and taxpayers. They're intrinsically linked in New Hampshire. We're going to kind of outline some of the ways we think that is for the better and some of the ways that it's for the worse. It's not a stagnant issue. This is getting increasingly challenging and more inequitable over time. It has been pretty dramatically the past 10 years or so. And in our view, and the recent court rulings kind of back that up, many elements of the system are deeply unconstitutional. So where I want to start is kind of where should our aspirations be for public education? Here in New Hampshire, we spend, on average, a lot of money per student compared to the rest of the country. we invest deeply in our public schools, even when it means taxing ourselves as homeowners, as property owners. And on average, we have really high achievement rates. We have really good schools. People there care deeply about them. They're community centers. So here's some stats of a public high school in New Hampshire. These stats tell part of the story. They don't tell the whole thing. Right, but you can see there's some pretty high achieving numbers relative to test scores, percent of students graduating. For students who decide to take AP tests, which you can get college credit for, having 91% get a 3 or above, which is generally what a college would take for credit. And then some of the metrics of the community. Teacher salary average, almost $80,000. Median household income is pretty high, over $130,000. And the education property taxes, about $8 per thousand. And this public high school also, last year in 2022, was awarded a pretty high honor for only a couple hundred schools get the National Blue Ribbon School, a couple hundred every year. I think there was 3 in New Hampshire this current year. And it's really just a mark of really high achieving, access to a lot of good opportunities, and really, I think, what we would all want our schools to be able to offer our students. About 30 miles down the road is a different public high school. Significantly lower test scores, big drop off in number of students who graduate, huge drop off in the number of students who choose, so these are still students who are choosing to take the AP tests. Only 30% or so are getting a 3 or above, which is generally required for credit in college. Instead of $80,000, teachers are making $50,000 on average. Median household income is dropping from $130,000 to $45,000. And yet property taxes are going up, $12.50 per thousand, which is about a $4,300 bill on a $350,000 home. So these 2 high schools are Hanover and Claremont. And what this hopefully illustrates is twofold. One, we have schools that on paper, some of these stats, right, these don't tell the whole picture, but some of these stats are really high achieving, right? And we have some schools on paper that are very low achieving. Both these schools, both these communities care deeply about their schools and invest deeply in them. Just last year, Claremont passed I think it was almost $1 million increase to their school budget, primarily to increase teacher pay to try to retain the teachers they had. And that was an active decision to raise their own taxes in order to invest back into a school that on paper is struggling in a lot of ways. So this is not to say that one community is doing a better job or cares more about their schools. It's just showing how far apart the experience of our different schools can be, and as it relates to property taxes. So 2 more kind of where are we now pictures. A few years ago, there was a commission to study school funding in the legislature. It was a 1-year commission. They spent $500,000, which for any of you who are familiar with the state legislature is a lot of money. Normally there's maybe a couple $1,000s, if any money at all, for commissions. So after a full year of work, hundreds of hours of testimony, stakeholder engagement, surveys around the state, the commission wrapped up with 2 main findings, largely. One, that the current system is inequitable for both students and taxpayers. And 2, that there is this negative correlation, this direct impact on student outcomes that's largely correlated with poverty around the state. Similar things what we've seen for decades, which John will get into. The other piece to kind of set the foundation of where we are right now is how much we rely on property taxes to fund our schools in New Hampshire. So this is showing total revenue for schools, and the most recently available data, a little over $3.5 billion. Again, a lot of money, especially relative to the size of our state and the size of our state budget. We care deeply and invest deeply in our schools, and on average, they are very good schools, produce very good results. We have a lot of confidence and support for our public schools in New Hampshire. But look at where this money is coming from, 60% from local property taxes. Another 10% here is from SWEP, that's the statewide education property tax. While it's technically a state tax, it does not go to the state. It is raised, retained, and kept locally. The state never touches that money, although they take credit for it, which we'll get into in a little bit. And so it's really 70% of total revenue from the state, or for public education, is coming from local property taxes. And just one other note, these are all available online and everything, and we'll make sure to send out an email for the whole slide deck after the fact, just because we will be going through some things, but an iteration we did the other night's online too, so this is will all be available as well. And then if you look at the state adequacy aid, the green portions, about 20%. That 20% is the smallest in the country for the state share of funding for public education. Smallest in the country. The reliance on property taxes, highest in the country. And a few other categories, federal, but the largest chunk, 70%, is coming from local property taxpayers. So how did we get here? That's kind of a complicated and long-winding question, so I'm going to pass it over to John, who has been working on this for a long time.
Yeah. I was going to say, I haven't been working on it since before Zach was born, but for a while. So my name is John Tobin, and I live in Concord.
You talk, I'll fix it.
Okay. And I was a career legal aid lawyer, and I retired from that about 9 years ago, and since then I've been working on this, but I worked on it, I worked on the original Claremont case, and people have asked me, well, why did you get involved in this? And the reason is my first posting in New Hampshire as a legal aid lawyer was up in Berlin. And I had a couple of young kids, and I saw in the newspaper that the Berlin city government was going to hold a hearing on its school budget. And I decided that I would march in there and really speak for the needs of kids, wanting to make sure that my kids got a really good education. And at that time, Berlin was a thriving blue-collar town and it had a good school system, but I wanted them to, spend whatever they needed to spend to make it good. And then as I got in the room, I looked around and I saw some of my elderly neighbors. And I heard from them. And they said, we care about the schools, we went to these schools, but we can't afford the property taxes. And that's when I realized that the state's funding system puts students and their parents and taxpayers in a box to fight over not much. It's a terrible situation where it pits generation against generation at a local level because the state is holding back. So I just want to add, before I go any further, how much I appreciate people like the people in Ware who you sacrifice for your schools. You don't have as much property wealth. You have below average property wealth, but you tax yourselves in order to support your schools. You care about those schools. You run fast and sweat to keep them going, and you should be proud of that. So I got involved in the Claremont case, and that wasn't even the first school funding case. There was one before that got settled, and there was a promise made to increase state aid, and it was never kept. That was called the Augenblick formula, and it was never funded by the legislature. So I worked with Andy Valinsky, who was the lead lawyer, and R.P. Saunders, who was another senior lawyer on the Claremont case. And that we filed that case on behalf of 5 school districts. And now I got to get you back. And after 2 trips to the Supreme Court, we won. And the court said, yes, there is a state obligation to provide for what they called a constitutionally adequate education. And that's sort of a cumbersome phrase, and I'll talk about what the court meant by that in a minute. And they also said that, it's a state obligation, and the state can delegate the performance of it to local school districts, but ultimately the state is responsible. And they also said that the taxes used to fund that state obligation, that core obligation, are state taxes. It's a state obligation, therefore there's state taxes, therefore the rate has to be the same around the state. Like every other state tax. Can you imagine the rooms and meals tax having a different rate in Ware than in Hopkinton? it's nonsensical. But this is a state obligation, that adequacy, and so the rates have to be the same. What does adequacy mean? It doesn't just mean reading and writing and arithmetic that people used to talk about as the sort of core education. The Supreme Court was really clear about this. They were thinking about, what do our kids need to succeed in the modern world? And they wrote this language at the end of the 20th century, but they were really looking ahead to this century. What do our kids need to succeed locally, regionally, nationally, internationally? What do we need to give them so that they can succeed? Because they're not all going to be in the same town they grew up in. They're going to be competing with kids from all over the place. So they said it's not just reading, writing, and arithmetic. It's a broad exposure to science and technology and health and world languages, all the kinds of things that kids need and the kind of education they get in places where they succeed. So what did the legislature do in response to these decisions? They made some reforms. One of them is they created the SWEP, the statewide education property tax that Zach alluded to. And that was a tax at a uniform rate across the state of about $6 per thousand. They also created some new funding that everyone now calls adequacy aid. And what did that do? It lowered property taxes most places. It lowered the education property taxes, which are the ones where the rates were so uneven, significantly. And even when you put back in the SWEP, the average property taxes went down significantly. Unfortunately, however, and one other thing it was interesting in those times, the New Hampshire legislature at that time was both House and Senate were run by Republicans. They were controlled by Republicans, and the governor was a Democrat. And the Republicans, looking at various funding options, got sort of close to passing an income tax. The Democratic governor said no, so that went away. And the point of this slide is we're not advocating for income tax. The point of the slide is the legislature in both parties looked at this, thought about all the possibilities. That could take place again. So, unfortunately, the record over the last 20 years, since that little bit of progress, and I think the heading of this slide says change at the margins. I think that gives the state too much credit. Really, it should say retreat. The state retreated. A coalition of wealthy towns who were unhappy about the fact that their property taxes went up persuaded the legislature to essentially let them keep some of the money that they were raising through that statewide tax for their own local purposes, even though it was a statewide tax. And we didn't know this until recently, until we filed our recent case. There are a number of places around the state where there are what are called, what we learned about, negative tax rates. These are small, unincorporated places where there's lots of valuable property, but not many students. And somebody decided at the Department of Revenue Administration, the state agency that sets tax rates, that the SWEP wouldn't apply in those towns because they didn't have any students, even though we're all responsible for all the kids in the whole state. So what that meant was the SWEP was nominally set as a tax rate, but then the DRA also did what's called a negative tax rate to essentially wipe it out. So homeowners, and we have some great examples of very fancy homes in some of those rural places, not paying that state tax at all, where everybody else is paying it. In the early 2000s, the town of Londonderry went back to court to try to get the state to live up to things, and the court reaffirmed what it said before. The state has to define and pay for an adequate education. But over the last 10 years, the state has really slid backward. I guess sliding backward is, I think, again, maybe too kind. They've really stepped away from their obligation. And that means that obligation, as expenses have gone up in the last 10 years, more than $500 million of new expenses have been laid on local property taxpayers, while the state's increased funding was only $47 million. So the state was pushing more of by doing nothing, the state was pushing more of the burden on all of us who are property taxpayers. And so then what happened? The commission that Zach alluded to, and that commission didn't come out of nowhere. That commission came out of a lot of advocacy in 2017 and 18 and 19 before the pandemic from people like you who were really unhappy about property taxes and the unfairness of this. We started doing these presentations around the state. We did, I'd say, around 70 of them in those 3 years, and people got fired up and they contacted their legislators and said, you need to fix this. And so the 2019 legislature did some modest improvements in the funding and created a commission, all expenses paid, as Zach alluded to study it. And that commission found, as Zach said, the system is inequitable from either a student or a taxpayer perspective. And in many places, the property wealth is so low that even at very high tax rates, those districts can't keep up spending-wise with districts that, because they have a lot of property, can tax at low rates and afford high-quality schools. And there's a relationship. You know, we are essentially giving up on a lot of kids because of this system. Poor kids really get shortchanged in every way, and their parents just as much. Sometimes when we do this presentation, we start out with a picture of students and then a picture of elderly taxpayers. This is about both of those constituencies. And it's also about business owners. Business owners pay more in property taxes than they pay in business taxes in this state. So here's the current state of what the state of New Hampshire provides for adequacy aid. And I want you to keep in mind that the average spending per pupil is about $20,000 per year, depending on whether you include transportation or debt service. But keep that $20,000 figure in mind. The state says that $4,100 is enough unless you happen to be a student that is poor, and the free lunch thing is just a marker or a measure of poverty. It's a way to figure out who should be eligible for that extra aid, or if you need help learning the English language, or if you're a special ed kid. But in most districts, most of the allocation of the state money is that $4,100 base for kids. The average, when you include the other things, is about, as you can see, about $5,100. So here's how this works in Ware and Henniker and Stoddard and Concord. And the green bar is, the big green bar is what's actually being spent, the cost per pupil. The two little bars are what's the state, how the state's helping out. The blue part, little part of that little bar is the SWEPT, which is, as we've said, really a property tax. And the little yellow piece is the state aid. So you can see who's contributing what. Property taxpayers are contributing the vast amount of this, and the state is contributing not so much. So we've done a couple of experiments or studies to try to figure out, well, what that state aid that the state says is enough and should pay for an adequate education, full stop, what would it actually pay for? And how do you compare that to an actual school budget? So this example that I'm about to go through with you is for Allenstown, but we've done this with Pittsfield and Hopkinton and some other places. And the idea is you sit down with the district's business manager, superintendent, and you get out the 500-item spreadsheet of all the particular expenses that a district has, and figure out what what do we need to eliminate from those expenses in order to get our spending down to the level the state says should be enough? Because the state says you should be able to get the job done unless you're one of the kids in one of these categories for $4,100. And in Allenstown, the state was giving some extra aid, so it was $4,900. And they were spending about $24,000. And Allenstown is a fairly small district with a lot of poverty. So they got out the spreadsheets and they started taking things off the budget in order to, again, bring that budget down to where it matched what the state said should be enough. So as you can see, they eliminated all transportation, all special ed contracted services, all out-of-district placements. And some of these things are clearly against the law. There are things that federal and state law require about special ed, but this was a budget exercise to try to get close to what the state says is enough. All art and music PE equipment, all Chromebooks, 3 of the 4 custodians, and sorry to say, this is just the first page. All summer programs, the art teacher, the music teacher, the PE teacher, 1 of 2 nurses, all substitute salaries, so if the teacher's sick, no class. Both guidance counselors, the crossing guards, the assistant principal, the tech support person, still not enough. Still not, even with cutting all those things. They're trying to save classroom and the classroom teachers, so they're trying to say, okay, what can we cut? Special ed paraprofessionals, one of the special ed teachers, the reading specialist, the library media specialist, the speech language person, all grounds maintenance, all SAU costs, so no superintendent, no audit, no lawyers. That's still not enough. They were still millions of dollars short or too high for what the state says was enough. So in Allenstown, they tuitioned their high school kids to Pembroke Academy. And they said, if we're going to get down to the number the state says is enough, we're going to stop that. We're going to essentially not have education past the 8th grade in Allenstown because we can't afford it, according to what the state says is enough money. So after they did that, they eliminated all those 3 pages of services and people. They had, for K through 4, 29 students per teacher, and for 5 through 8, 38 students per teacher, and nothing after the 8th grade. And that's how they got down to a budget level that matched what the state said was enough. How anyone could say that $4,100 in 2022 is enough to provide an education is, it's just laughable. It's actually, it's not laughable, it's ridiculous. That's kind of where we are at the current. We're going to talk a little bit about the lawsuits that are going on now. But now we're going to turn a little bit to the property tax piece of this to dig a little deeper about how that works.
Thank you. And this exercise that John just went through is clearly an exercise in the absurd, but this very exercise was part of the trial, the Conval trial. So John will get into that in a little bit, but it was part of a formal lawsuit that's happening, and it was admitted as evidence in part because it's absurd, and in part because the question being asked in that trial is at its core, how much money should the state be providing to students? And the fact that many of those things were required by state law, federal law, or rules, you'd think that if they're required, then the state would pay for them, right? But that's the chicken and egg that is the Conval lawsuit that John will get into. And so even on the stand, there are witnesses being provided by the state of New Hampshire who, when asked, well, how much does it cost? I don't know, you tell me, basically. You should define it, school district, not us, the state. But we're only gonna give you a specific amount. Okay, well, how do you come up with that? No, that's your job to tell, like, how much we should pay you. Just back and forth and back and forth. And so while it is kind of a ridiculous example to an extent, that's kind of what has been playing out in one of the lawsuits that's been going on with a straight face. So it's hard to imagine how that is. So to talk a little bit more about getting into kind of like what are some of the impacts of this on a tax perspective, right? So one of the ways that we look at comparing communities, because Ware is different than Stoddard, is different than Concord, is different than Keene or Portsmouth, both from kind of the economics and geographics of the area, but also just student population. So what we do is we take this measure of looking at what's the equalized value per pupil. So how much taxable property is behind each individual student that could be taxed to raise money? It's just a good kind of like getting apples to apples about, in general, what's the size of the bank, the size of the property value that can be tapped with property taxes to pay for education per student. And so the quick example is, if John Stark needed to buy $10,000 worth of audio equipment, right? And so did Portsmouth and so did Keene. Amazon or whoever you're getting the audio equipment from doesn't care where you're buying that from, right? It's a fixed price. It's $10,000 for the same equipment. So let's say that here in Ware, the property values are $1 million, $10 tax rate, equalized values. You raise $10,000. But say nearby in Hillsborough, the property value is only $400,000. The same tax rate doesn't get you as much money. So to raise the same amount of money, Hillsborough would have to have a tax rate 2.5 times higher, and you're still only raising $10,000. And so this equalized value per pupil is a good measure of kind of, in general, communities' ability, their economic ability, their capacity to raise money for their schools. So what this is showing is one dot for every single community in the state, except 17 that have off the charts value per pupil. And what you can see is that 75%, so here's the average, about $1.6 million in value per pupil. 75% of all the students in the state live in communities with below average property values. Below average property values per pupil. So by definition, are disadvantaged by the system that relies so heavily on generating revenue from local property taxes, some more than others, right? It's hard to find many public policies that in general disadvantage 75% of the whole state, right? And this includes our biggest cities, our smallest communities, towns in every single county. It includes communities that represent the entire breadth of what we have in New Hampshire. So this is not a just Rockingham County problem or a just rural problem, right? This is it deeply impacts every walk of life, every makeup of community in the state. Here's the same data displayed a slightly different way. So here's the equalized value per pupil. So that's what we were seeing in the last one. But we've organized it by tax rates. Education tax rates. So in general, what you can see is that as equalized value per pupil goes up, tax rates go down. In general, there's always exceptions. It's not a perfect measure. But what it's showing is that in general, when you have more property value to tax, you have more wealth, you can keep your tax rates a little bit lower because those lower tax rates are raising more money. So we've pulled out a few examples here. And just look at some of these are all education tax rates. So look at how much Henniker is raising, $14 per thousand. They're raising about $16,000, right? Stoddard, about half the tax rate, raising more money per pupil. Doesn't tell the whole picture. There are tuition agreements. There's different things that districts do to try to equalize that, right? But in general, higher property values, you can keep your taxes down. Does anyone know what some of the easiest indicators of a community's property values are? Like you have to guess where some of the higher property values are in the state. What are some of the indicators? Lakes? Ocean, seacoast? Yeah. In general, lakefront, oceanfront, a ski mountain, specific destination like a Conway area where people are really going there for tourism, for skiing. In general, natural resources like access to waterfront. And so to kind of twist this around from tax rates to how much money is actually coming out of our pockets, we just went on Zillow and looked at a bunch of houses that were for sale in a number of communities around the state. And so what you can see here is a house on the left from Tufton Borough is worth a little over $500,000. Honestly, this was 2 years ago now, so it's probably worth a lot more. And their school property tax bill, the total amount of school taxes they're paying for the local tax bill was just under $2,000. In Hillsborough, a house worth $150,000, about a third-ish, basically paying the exact same property tax bill for their local education property taxes. So in general, it's probably fair to assume that whoever can afford the house worth $560,000 probably has more income, more ability to pay than the folks that are living in the house worth $150,000. And what we see is this adds to an overall just regressivity of the tax structure in New Hampshire, where in general, right, these are averages, they help show the trends. In general, the more money you make, in general, you're paying a significantly smaller proportion of that income to taxes. The largest driver of that, the property tax. That's that blue bar here. So these are income levels, lowest on the left, highest on the right. So for example, what you can see is the middle-ish income group, 45,000 to 72,000. These numbers are this most recently available data from this particular analysis. We're figures out of date here. They still paint the picture. 45,000 to 72,000, over 6% of their income is going towards property taxes. If you're making over $500,000, less than 2% of your income is going to property taxes. In general, you see this where if you can afford to be in a community that has higher property value, that keeps your tax rates significantly lower. And yet those lower tax rates are generating a significant amount of revenue and money for your local schools. And so a few other kind of implications of this deep disparity, right? These like layers of regressivity in our tax system. One is teacher salaries. Reaching Higher is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research group that puts out a lot of good data on education, both funding and policy in the state. And they looked at starting teacher salaries around the state. And they found some very specific trends relative to property value, a number of people living at or below the poverty line, impact on teacher salaries. And so you can see some pretty significant differences here, right? We were just up in Pittsfield recently. Some of my colleagues went there last week, and they said that they don't have any world language teachers in the high school right now. None. If they want to take world languages, they have to use VLAX, which is an online platform. It's good they have access, but not quite the same as having teachers in the school. They posted jobs for that this summer. Not a single person applied. Because nearby in Barnstead, they were hiring for the same position, $10,000 more for the starting salary. Can you blame someone for taking the same job relatively close by for $10,000 more? I mean, teachers are not getting rich, right? And so we see, especially in such a small state, that the dramatic variation in teacher salaries has a huge impact on some districts that are turning through teachers year after year. They're not staying for more than 3-4 years, and they're going 5, 10, 15 miles away and getting significant pay increases, right? Here's some data more specific. So Henniker, Ware, and Stoddard here. And you see some of the trends. The average is the dotted line, teacher salaries. Henniker bouncing around the average, Ware and Stoddard a little lower. This is one more piece from the Reaching Higher report that kind of really drove home kind of the deep disparities for me. So what we have is the highest paying school district at the time in green, their step increases, the lowest paying in red. You'd have to make your way 18 steps in the lowest paying district to reach the starting salary of the highest paying school district. And again, this is not the whole picture, right? But the ability to attract, retain, especially now, attract and retain workforce and be able to compete. I mean, like, if you don't have a workforce, you don't have a school, you don't have any business, right? And that has an impact both on the quality of the instruction you're able to offer, but also on the kids, the ability for them to build connections with teachers year after year, the ability of administrators to build systems and build relationships, et cetera, right? So this has deep impacts throughout both the school system and the ability of the teachers to stay here. And so I'm going to come back to this one piece here, and we're getting up to the point of, okay, so there's a lot of things that feel like they're wrong with the system. What's being done about it? We're going to dig into the current lawsuits that have been referenced a few times. But I want to bring you back to here. Again, both because we have the ability in New Hampshire to have schools that are hitting a lot of marks, right? And again, on paper, this is helpful to a degree, right? Test scores measure some things, not others, right? But we have school districts in the state that are really high achieving, doing a very good job, retaining their staff, turning out really amazing programming. We have a ton of school districts that are, all over that spectrum, but we have some that are really struggling, and the averages tend to hide some of those disparities. So to jump into kind of some of the most recent lawsuits, I'll hand it back over to John.
Thanks. So, thinking back to what we were talking about before about how the situation has gotten a lot worse in the last 10 years and the burden higher on local taxpayers and school districts suffering. In 2019, the Conval School District and some others in that part of the state decided they'd had enough, and they filed a new lawsuit. And Conval is Contoocook Valley. It's a school district that includes Peterborough and Jaffrey and some other places in that part of the state. The judge quickly ruled in their favor without having a full trial. The state appealed. After 18 months at the Supreme Court, the court sent it back for a full trial. That trial took place in May of this year. And at this stage, a whole lot more school districts joined that case, including Manchester, Nashua, and they're listed in the next slide, which I forgot to give you. And the school districts that are now the plaintiffs in that case against the state serve about 25% of all the students in the state. So it's a pretty representative sample of school districts. Hill is in there, which is a tiny school district near Franklin. And again, Manchester and Nashua, which are the largest school districts, are in there. So after this trial, the judge went through all the evidence and he issued a 56-page decision 3 days before Thanksgiving. And I want to talk a little bit about what he said. And he said, he recited some of the history, and he went back to the Constitution and said, the Constitution says, and it has always said, it's the state responsibility to pay for a constitutionally adequate education. And after hearing 3 weeks of evidence from school officials, from school board members, I think more than 25 witnesses, he came up with what he said was a conservative number, that 7,356 per student, as compared to what the state said was adequate, which is 4,100. And let me just say a little bit about the trial. I went and watched all of this trial, and the state did not bring in any witness who said 4,100 is enough, and here's why. And they acknowledged that they were not going to do that. They had no way to prove the validity of that number. That number was landed on by the legislature and then gradually adjusted for inflation and tinkered with a little bit. But the state didn't even try to justify the number. What they tried to do instead was attack all the other witnesses' expertise or their understanding, or point out where they were exaggerating. It made me think of sort of an old lawyer thing. If you have a case and you're a lawyer and the facts are bad but the law is good, you emphasize the law. And if the law is bad, but the facts are good, you emphasize the facts. And if neither the facts or the law are good, you emphasize procedure. And that's what they did. They really relied on burden of proof. They basically said, you have to prove that this number is wrong, and we don't have to justify it. And the judge heard all that for 3 weeks, and he didn't buy it. He said that at a bare minimum, it costs $7,300. And the decisions are on our project's website. They're on the Supreme Court's website. They're really worth reading because he really analyzes it carefully from a pragmatic, numbers-based perspective, and also he's mindful of his role as a judge. He's not the legislature. He's mindful of his role as a judge. And he says throughout, ultimately the legislature should have the last word, but this 7,300 is a bare minimum. And he said several times, if the legislature digs into this, the actual number is likely to be considerably higher than that. The Conval plaintiffs had asked that it be set around $10,000. There's pages and pages of calculations. He listened to the testimony of a number of people, and especially the superintendent from Conval, who looked at teacher salaries, the cost of health insurance, looked at all these different variables, and in every case he picked a low number, or there was an average and he discounted it. So he went through a really careful mathematical exercise, but always erred on the low side. So doing the math, the state says we're only responsible for 4,100, and the judge says, no, you're not. You're responsible for at least 7,300. That's a difference of $537 million in money that is already being spent, is already being raised, but it's being raised by local property taxes, and the state has to find another way to raise it. So this is kind of an answer to your question, and again, the ruling has it in much more detail for pages and pages, but this is a rough summary of the components of his number. And you know, he said, I'm being conservative, I'm being cautious, I don't want to stretch this in any way, I want to err on the other side. And the Conval plaintiffs, when they were arguing for $10,000 per kid, were basically saying the same thing. So here's in writing what he said. The state presented no evidence to justify the current base adequacy amount. No evidence. So how will this decision change adequacy funding? And if right now the state said $4,100 should do the trick, and we're paying for that $4,100 through SWEPT and through adequacy aid. But the judge said there's a whole gap here you're not paying for. The true cost is at least $7,300. So that difference amount you're raising in an unfair way. And so it's our view that makes it pretty clear that the current local school funding tax is unconstitutional across the state, because we're all being asked to pay different rates to meet the state's duty when we should all be paying at the same rate. So again, what he's talking about is not, we don't need $500 million more spent in the schools. We need a different way to raise the money we're already spending. So this is the pie chart that Zach showed you before about the current sources of funding for public schools. And this is a chart that shows if the ruling was implemented, and the new money is that yellow slice of the pie. So because the new number is a lot bigger than the old number, but it's still very modest, it's still only a little more than a third of the actual cost of education, there's still going to be a burden on local property taxpayers, but it's going to go down from 60 to 48 as the state picks up more of its responsibility. So the judge has made clear, the court has always made clear, it's up to the legislature to pick the revenue sources. That is profoundly a legislative job, to figure out how to raise the money. And the court's not going to pick revenue sources. The court's going to set out what the constitutional guidelines or parameters are, but it's up to the legislature to pick the funding. But here's a few ideas. The legislature has recently decided to repeal interest and dividends tax in its entirety. If they put it back, that would be $135 million. If they added additional money to the SWEPT to bring it up to about $4 per thousand, as you recall, at one point it was $6 per thousand. That would bring a lot of money. If you brought the business taxes back up to where they were in 2015, that would also be a way to raise the money. And again, the legislature should have the final word, and our job as citizens is to talk to our legislators and tell them how we want to do this. If we don't want an income tax, but we want a bigger statewide property tax, we should say so. If we want a combination of things, we should say so. It's up to them to craft it. It's up to us to tell them what we want and what we don't want. So, in addition to the Conval case, I'm part of a group that filed a case on behalf of property taxpayers, homeowners and business owners. And this gentleman is Steve Rand. He owns a hardware store in Plymouth, and he owns a home. And Plymouth is a place where the local property taxes are high because the tax base is low. We also have a guy who's a volunteer fireman in Hopkinton. We have a retired doctor who owns a home in Concord and owns property in Pennacook. We have a elderly man in Newport. All homeowners, business owners, or property owners who get hurt by this system, who are paying at tax rates that are unfair. They're too high. And it's important for the court and for everybody else to see that, helping our students succeed is incredibly important, but protecting the rights of our taxpayers is also really important. And one of the interesting things about this whole tax argument is that we have this tax clause in our Constitution because our founders had a real vivid memory of oppressive tax systems from the King of England. So the constitutional provision is really a limit on government. It's a profoundly conservative limit. It says you can't play favorites. That if you're imposing a state tax, the rate has to be the same. It has to be proportional. And that's, again, to sort of prevent politically powerful people or other people from persuading the legislature to play favorites. In this second case that I'm working on with Andy Valinsky and a young lawyer named Natalie LaFlamme and some volunteer lawyers from a New York law firm, we're all a band of volunteers, we're saying that because the state is ducking its responsibility, taxpayers like our clients and like many of you have to fill in the gap. If the true cost of an adequate education is $7,300 and the state's paying only $4,100, where does the rest of the money come? It comes from local property taxpayers at different rates. So we are trying to get the court to make clear that if the adequacy amount is higher, then the taxes need to be uniform to pay for all of that. In the Rand case, we're also challenging that number. We think the number isn't 7,300 or 10,000. It's closer maybe to 14,000 if you look at actual school budgets. And one of the interesting things in the Conval trial is that all these school officials go through their budgets and the attorney general's going through them trying to find the fluff. Where are the climbing walls? Where are the swimming pools? Where's the fluff? And the only thing they could really find was sports. And the school said, yeah, we're right. Sports are not part of a constitutionally adequate education, but they're a really marginal part of most budgets. Most budgets are really paying for the basics. So in the Rand, we're trying to get that adequacy number up, knock out those tax rates. We also think that the amounts that the state pays for kids that need special ed or English language learning or poor are way low. And the special ed thing, we just did some research, and it turns out that the average spending on a special ed kid in New Hampshire is about $27,000 a year, and the state says $2,600 is enough. So that's a place, and special ed budgets really wreak havoc with local districts, small districts. They also cause a lot of tension between that family that has the special needs kid and the taxpayers who don't want to be singled out to pay for it. So the state needs to step up in that arena as well. So we're, in the Rand case, we haven't had the full trial on the merits, but we filed some motions to get the judge to make some rulings because we thought there was no dispute of fact or law, and he agreed. One of the things he agreed was that the legislature's system to cut the wealthy towns a break and not make them send in their SWEP, their state tax, was unconstitutional because it essentially lowered, in essence, lowered the tax rate for those taxpayers in those towns. I had talked a little before about the negative tax rates. He said that's unconstitutional too. If it's a state tax on property, every property owner pays it, not those. It doesn't depend on how many kids happen to live near this mansion in this rural place. So now I'm going to turn it back to Zach. This effort is really, and always has to be, a two-part effort. It's a shame that there have to be any lawsuits at all. If the state met its duty and legislatures followed their oath to follow the Constitution, the lawyers could go home. But in order to make this change, it's a two-part effort. It's lawyers in court enforcing the Constitution, and it's all of us in our democracy getting the legislature to move. And here's Zach going to talk about that.
All right, so just the last few pieces here, and then happy to open it up for questions. Before kind of jumping into recent legislative activity and some future things, I just want to kind of pause and, wouldn't it be nice if the legislature just listened to the courts? I mean, you don't have to appeal a ruling. The conventional wisdom is that the state will appeal these most recent rulings and fight it. In Pennsylvania last year, there was a 900-page rule, basically the same context, decades of inequitable funding, lawsuits, back and forth, 900-page ruling from their state Supreme Court that laid out how inequitable this whole thing was. And the plaintiffs in that case, I think it was the governor and the defendants, the governor, the House Speaker, right? They didn't appeal. They said, you know what, we're just gonna work on solving this instead. So just to, you don't have to appeal. It's not like this is a new issue. The judge wasn't laying out new things. And so instead of appealing and dragging this out for another year or 2 years, right, we could just start working on how to solve it. Just throwing that out there. So recent legislative activity. In the past budget, there was a significant increase in school funding. Education funding actually ended up being kind of a pivotal piece to pass the budget out of the House, which anyone watching this past year knows that the State House in Concord is almost split. The majority party has only a few members more, so it just is you need to have bipartisanship to get anything passed, especially something like a state budget. School funding ended up being one of the key pieces in the amendment that passed the budget out of the House. There was some increased targeted aid and the increased school funding by about $157 million, which is the most in recent years in any one budget. But it was just that little yellow piece. So again, a step in the right direction, but in the context of how little funding actually comes from the state, not a massive impact. And unfortunately, it was largely paid for by cutting what was known as stabilization aid. So it was a different aid category that generally targeted money towards school districts and communities with lower property values, higher concentrations of students with high need. So kind of cut one aid category to then bolster some other funding. In the end, in general, a little more funding across the board, but that will not go into the future. And so the cuts from the stabilization aid really harmed largely rural communities with declining student populations and higher levels of poverty. They did this thing called hold harmless grants to make sure no one lost money this year. The legislature often does things in 2-year increments because that's how long the cycles are. So no one's going to lose money this year. But if the law doesn't get changed, there's going to start being steep drop-offs 2, 3, 4, 10 years down the road. We talked about revenue sources a little bit earlier. One to flag specifically that John mentioned was this interest and dividends. The big question after these lawsuits is, okay, so how is the state going to pay for it? The state's going to take on that responsibility of an additional $500 million to shift that burden from property taxpayers. Where are they going to get the money? There's a number of options. None of them are going to solve it individually, but reducing revenue is probably not a good place to start. So the interest and dividends tax, over half of it came from people who were earning more than $200,000 a year on income just from interest and dividends. You have to have between $3 and $10 million at work generating that income to be taxed at that rate. And that's just from the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute. They did a huge brief and analysis on that. There's a number of bills that will be up in the next legislative session. These are LSRs right now. They are getting signed bill numbers currently and will all be out in the next few weeks and then formally adopted into the House in January. There are some that are directly related to the lawsuit. So these are filed by members who are looking forward to the lawsuit and saying, hey, we're being sued about these specific topics. Let's put in some legislation to start figuring out how we might address this. That top one there is basically the Conval lawsuit. Increased base adequacy to 10 grand per kid. It's a one-page bill. It's very simple, very expensive, right? But it's, what would that look like? This is how this gets solved, is policy, right? So how would we fund that? Is $10,000 enough? Is it too much? Should we do $7,300 from the judge? Let's have a conversation about this in the body that needs to actually address it, the legislature. There's a few bills relative to special education asking the same questions. Is $2,300 per student to provide those additional services enough? Compared to how much it actually costs, it's nowhere close. Where's state responsibility? What are some of the challenges there? These are deeply complex systems, but not talking about it is the one thing that is not actually going to help this at all. And then this last one down here I point out is exactly what was just ruled in the Rand lawsuit. Wealthier communities cannot keep their excess swept, not allowed to have negative taxes anymore, which is an insane concept to begin with, but that was what the ruling just came down as, and there's a bill that would literally address exactly that. So it'll be interesting to see kind of if the legislature, with an opportunity to comply directly with a recent ruling, will just go ahead and try to pass that. And with this one up here, actually dig into what that would look like. Next year is not a budget year, so increasing significant spending is incredibly challenging in a non-budget year, but we can start talking through that. What data are we missing? What would make this more equitable? If we raised a statewide property tax, who would get hurt in what communities? So do we need to add exemptions or tax breaks to make sure that people are paying what they can afford and not getting harmed anymore? And so just to kind of wrap up here, and then again, happy to answer any questions that folks might have. There's a lot of layers to this. One is as both students and taxpayers, right? Students are getting harmed by this system, right? Access to world languages, access to teachers that are there on a continuing basis and not turning over, access to appropriate mental health services, ability to go to school in a building that's not literally falling down or has lead in the water. Those impact teachers too, and SAU staff as well, right? And schools serve as a hub for our community for so many more things outside of the classroom activities. It's a problem that's continuing to get worse. We're paying, as local property taxpayers, about $2 billion a year to fund our public education system, currently, local property taxes, right? A significant portion of that should be the responsibility of the state government. we think it's unconstitutional. And just to be clear, I think we try to hammer this point again and again and again, but this is a solution that lies with state level lawmakers, right? These are policies that are currently in place that define how much money goes to schools, where the revenue comes from. They are the only ones that have the ability to change this. So engaging with them is how we make sure that we are moving in the right direction, and this is not a continuing problem from here on out. Our last slide here is just some ways you can take action. And I'll turn it over to my colleague Casey to just name a few of those, and then we're happy to take some questions.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Casey. I'm the project's outreach and engagement director. I talked to most of you guys when you came in the door, but now that you've got all the information from Zach and John, the question is kind of how do we keep the ball moving in the right direction? As you know, we've got the stage pretty well set with the decisions from the Conval and RAND cases. So the best way to, stay involved and keep the pressure on is to be involved directly with the legislature. So at the end of the day, as you know now, the legislature is responsible for making this change. And those are folks that you elect into office who are accountable directly to you. So staying involved, on our newsletter, as we get into the legislative session, that's where we'll be sending out all of our action alerts and opportunities to get involved, to testify, to contact your legislators. Typically, so all that legislation that Zach went over that's coming up, those are all great opportunities, and sometimes we don't know when those are going to go before a committee or before the House until a week before or a couple of days before. So staying on our list and staying in the loop so you know what's going on and when those kind of critical action points are is a great way to help. These postcards that I handed out when you guys came in, if you fill them out and give them back to me on your way out, we're going to send them to the legislature. So that's one, small step that you can take today to kind of help move the ball forward. We put out new content on social media pretty much every week, so sharing that around on your personal pages to help get your friends and family aware of the issue is another great way to help. Writing letters to the editor. If you need any help with anything like that, you can always contact our staff. Our contact information is on the website. And yeah, so stay involved on our newsletter list. That's really the best way to stay in the loop. And if you want to do this postcard today, that's going to hopefully make a nice impact at the start of the legislative session to kind of set the tone. So that's all I've got.
So thank you very much. Really appreciate it, and we're happy to answer any and all questions that we can. Go ahead. Yes. Yeah, we're gonna send. Yeah, we'll send them to the local.
Yeah, we're gonna fill it.
Thank you.
So happy to. If you want to shout them out, and I can repeat them if people can't hear them. Go ahead.
I was curious, going back to the local funding, 7%, what impact is the federal requirements on each school district? Do you know the quantitative effect of that requirement and dollar figures on us?
I'm just going to repeat your question to make sure I have it right. So you're referencing the 7% of funding coming from the federal government, and the question was basically is 7%, how much costs are associated with federal requirements on school districts, and kind of does that match the 7%?
Are they funding 7% and causing 25% of the cost?
I don't know that off the top of my head. My guess is that it is not matched up as such, and that is largely the crux of what the Conval case was saying at the state level, though. You're only paying 20%, but let us lay out all the laws that we have to follow from the state and rules that we think add up to way more than 20%, but you're only giving us 20%, but the level of requirements put on you by the state far exceeds that. So I don't know the federal off the top of my head, but the state is definitely, that was kind of the crux of the Conval suit, is that the disparity there.
Let me add just one thing to that, and that's in the realm of special ed. The federal government, when it created the federal law that requires special ed, and now most states have their own law that requires it as well, the federal government promised to fund it at 40%, and they've never come close. So when you get done getting the state legislature straightened out through your lobbying, we need to get our congressional delegation to say to fund what they've required. So your question is a good one.
Go ahead, sir.
Good evening. My name's Matt. I live in Hannaford, New Hampshire. Very good presentation. And I must say you guys put together a nice synopsis for those of us that weren't sure exactly what this was going to all be about. My biggest concern is always moving things away from the local level. It's obvious. When people get their tax bill, that biggest chunk is always the school. And unfortunately, they get most of the punches thrown at them because of that. But I often feel like when you move that away from the local level, oh, where's the state? Let's assume like the number's never gonna work. You're just gonna take that difference and now let the state.
Yeah.
Is that'll last for a while and then, well, hey, costs are going up. We gotta add to that. And we are gonna lose more control locally because we don't see that number. It's just, it's gonna go and increase in, I don't know, state and meals tax, business tax, small business owners. I'm just concerned about that. I like having the local eye. It's one reason why I've never supported a state income tax. Because the logic would be like, oh, but your town taxes are gonna go way down. And they will for a while, but then all of a sudden you're paying a state income tax, and all of a sudden, your total tax is gonna be above that original amount you were paying. And I just worry about getting out of the local level. So how do you keep an eye on this?
Yeah.
If we kick it to the state or kick it to the feds. Because by the way, we are the state, we are the feds. It's our money. So I don't want to lose track of it. That's my point.
Yeah, great question. Did everyone hear? Okay, so good question. We get this pretty much every time. One thing I'm going to answer with is I'm going to challenge the idea about how much local control we have now. So to the gentleman's question from earlier, what level of local control do you have when the state legislature will pass different either mandates? For example, Holocaust and genocide studies are now required in schools. I happen to think that's a good thing that students should learn about, right? But it's a requirement and no additional funding came with it, right? That's not any control, and there are a lot of examples of that, of state rules, state laws that require specific things of schools to do with no funding attached to them. And so kind of like what we currently have control over relative to school spending is, I think, a lot smaller than most people realize. And also who has that control is very different. So for example, if you're in your negotiations, you wanted to, I use the Claremont example, give all your staff a 10% raise because you're worried about staff leaving, turnover, right? That 10% raise, let's say that costs $1.50 on the tax bill, right? That exact 10% raise in New London would be a 50-cent tax increase. So who has the control there, right? It's a very different conversation, even if everyone is trying to support their school. So I guess my point being, one, that I think that we have less control now than we might think, and some communities have significantly more control than others. And two, I want people like you at the table when there's conversations being made at the state legislature. Like, these are the good questions to be asking. If we're shifting some of this away, are there different strings attached? Who gets tax breaks? How can we guarantee that, to your point, taxes are not just going to be increased overall? But those conversations aren't even happening if no one's acknowledging that there's an issue, and we're not taking some of these bills seriously to say, what would the impact here be? So hopefully I wasn't intentionally trying to dodge it. Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah, please.
So again, kind of going away from, you're saying, well, geez, we're not telling our legislatures that if you are going to mandate X, and it's going to cost us Y, how are we going to get that? Well, shame on us for maybe, if I elected you as my state rep and I didn't know you mandated that, shame on me for not knowing that and saying, hey, Zach, I'm not voting for you ever again, because, if that's my feeling.
Yeah.
So again, I feel like you take it off the table. Don't worry about it. We got it taken care of by the state. I don't know how. I just don't see this. You're still going to have inequality, and that's the biggest thing. And I think people. I don't want to start naming towns, but since you had Claremont and Hanover up there, everyone probably in this room has been. They are two dramatically different towns for very different reasons. Those are never going to be equal. Whether you kick this to the states or the feds, their school systems are
Yeah, it's a fair point. I think one of the things, and this came out of the Commission Studies School Funding, is this difference from equity to equality, right? So the current school, right? So equality is looking at Hanover and Claremont as they currently exist and saying we're going to give you roughly the same, but they're on different worlds, right? Equity is saying for a lot of reasons, a lot of layers, Claremont is struggling. So we should give you more money and more resources to recognize the different challenges you have. And in this past state budget, one of the disappointing things was there was a shift from equity to equality. So we took out some funding that was looking at other elements of communities, their relative poverty levels, their the number of students living in poverty, right? Took some of that money out and said every student in the state gets a little bump. So that Portsmouth gets the same bump as Claremont as whereas Henniker. And so, yes, I agree. Like no single public policy is going to totally right everything, and there's a lot of other factors, right? But by not acknowledging those factors and targeting resources in a way that acknowledges that some communities are not on a level playing field, I think just exacerbates the problem.
Yeah, your question is, one that we get often about local control. And in one of the Claremont decisions, the court said, we have nothing against local control, and the state is free to delegate the performance of education and to give localities a lot of discretion about lots of decisions. What the state can't do is delegate the financial responsibility. So I think, one of the problems we have is we have a school board in Pittsfield and a school board in Dunbarton, and there's not a level playing field for decision making. The people in Pittsfield, really the question is, what do we cut next? We can't ask any more of our taxpayers, but we can't afford a science teacher or a language teacher. What do we cut next? That's their local control. And one of the interesting things, we have a colleague named Doug Hall, who was a Republican legislator from Chichester and is just a genius in lots of ways and understands this stuff so well. And he went back 100 years and looked at the history of school funding. And there was a state crisis about school funding at the end of World War I, because what people figured out during that war was that New Hampshire students were illiterate. They were not fit in many circumstances to be in the Army. They just hadn't had a good education. So that was sort of a kick into the business leaders and state government to say, we got to step up our game here a little bit. But what they found at that time was the wealthy communities were the mill towns. The Claremonts and Manchesters were the places where the wealth was, where the property wealth was. And the tourist industry that we have now had not kicked in. And the poor places were the poor rural places. And in that reshuffling of the deck, the wealthy mill towns had to kick in again because it's a statewide thing. So in some ways, the fact that Hanover and Claremont are very different, it's not carved in stone. It didn't come from heaven. It came from long-term economic changes. And there will be more long-term economic changes. But what we're saying is we really need to give the local school boards an equal shot, a level playing field, so they can make the decision, Chinese or Japanese, a little higher salaries or a few more teachers. Those are the decisions that should be left to but give each school board a relatively decent shot at the same resources, or as Zach is saying, if they have a population that has more needs. I mean, there are a lot more needy kids for a lot of different reasons in Manchester than there are in Bow. In Colebrook, there's a lot more needs for school buses than there is in Manchester. There's a lot of local variation that needs to be taken into account, but we need to give those local folks a level shot financially.
Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, my name is Zach Lawson. I'm on the school board here actually at the high school. Can you go back to your pie chart by any chance?
Yeah.
If you wouldn't mind, please. Doesn't matter which version, just I want to do a little mental gymnastics here around, the pie
Oh,
chart.
here, this is the current.
Yeah, this one or the other one. So, for those of you that have seen our budget presentations here at the high school or in either of the local communities in Henniker or where, you're probably familiar with the pie chart that we show regularly that shows that our personnel costs in our district
shifting 60 students up or down makes or breaks entire, student populations in classrooms and changes the way that the salary, work looks given the sort of the tax base to pay for it. All of this is to say, like, you can get in the weeds really quick here. You could admire the problem, like, infinitely on this. And so, we do this a lot at the school board level here. You gave a great example of what, Pittsfield is dealing with. I'm not on the Ware School Board, but every sense I have is very much a thing that goes on in Ware regularly. We do it here at the high school. It doesn't happen perhaps as much in Henniker, although we're beginning to hit that point in Henniker. I guess what I'm kind of looking for here is so that we don't stay in this cycle of admiring the problem because, we as school board members are really focused on that local control and the stuff we can do at the local level. And we've got folks like you who are doing a great job, sharing out to the local level. Like for a lot of folks, it might be the first time they're hearing kind of like the woe be unto most New Hampshire residents that this is what we have to deal with. What is like a good, straightforward, simple proposal that would exist for lawmakers at the state level to say, like, look, if it were just like this, okay, right? This would work. I feel like somebody has to stick their neck out and say that instead of being afraid to say it. Like, oh, we can never go for a broad-based tax like that. Don't you know that that's suicide for all these other reasons, right? Like, what's wrong with putting that out there as something that would be, look, it solves the problem. It addresses the big issue, for the state and for the local control.
Well, first off, we never get in the weeds, so that's not a problem we have.
We never get into legalese.
I think you're asking, this is the crux of the problem, right? Is that there is no one answer. And some of the answers have intense political, people have intense political or electoral feelings about broad-based taxes, for example, right? But I think what we come back to, and we're a nonprofit organization, we talk about politics and engage in politics, but we are not partisan and we don't engage in any electoral elements. And so a piece of that is that part of the importance is talking to your legislators and saying, what are you going to do about this issue? Is helping them understand that this is something you all want them to care about. And because I don't have the single answer. I mean, we can show you some of the different taxes and the revenues that they'll generate, right?
That gets back in the weeds, though, right?
It gets back in the weeds, yeah. And so, one of the examples I use is that I think most people running for office have a stance and a position on abortion, and they can tell you what it is. Whatever the range of the spectrum is, right? It's an issue that they understand, people will ask them about. Access to health care, reproductive rights, abortion, pretty hot topics, right? But how many people have that same level of like, I'm definitely going to be asked about this around education funding and property taxes? Some people all the time, right? And so, but some people not at all. We do this presentation, and every time there are reps or former reps, right? And some of them do not know this at all.
That's actually, and that's true not just of this, but other topics.
Yeah.
Definitely legislative levels. If you've ever attended a public hearing, or you've spoken at a public hearing, you realize real quick how little some legislators know about a particular topic that they are sitting for that hearing for. It would be a damn shame that this would be one of them. It really shouldn't be. But my point ultimately is that it doesn't matter whether it's you guys or not. Like, what are the solutions that are out there? I think it's great to have an audience here learning what the problem is, but I'd be really frustrated if we all go home and we're like, man, that's a big problem, and we just sit here and we just bemoan the problem. Like, what are the things? Who's got the solutions? They could be crap solutions, but what are they? What are the ones that are being talked about here, rather than appealing to the legislature for $10,000 minimum adequacy? Like, what does the real solution look like there?
I mean, part of the loss, like that is in one sense a real solution. Is it the best one? Probably not.
Because that's the very next question that
Right.
people ask.
Right.
To everybody's point, it's like, what's our money anyway? So are we just going to pay more to the state if you're a business owner, or you can take the burden more than sort of the average taxpayer? And the answer might be, yeah, if we take that solution.
Yeah.
So that's, I think, what I'm certainly wondering this at the state level. The legislature will politic because that's what they know what to do. That's how they live their lives. That's how they operate every single day. Let's cut through all the BS.
Yeah, I guess the short answer is I couldn't agree more, and part of why we were founded as an organization is to try to help push that, but it's not just in politics that people are scared to talk about revenue. Like, there are reputable organizations that do a lot of this work that will not put out here's what a 1% income tax would raise in theory, because it is seen in New Hampshire talking about revenue. You cross a point, not just broad-based taxes, you cross a point talking about taxes, and it is seen as just not smart to keep your funders, to keep the legislature engaged with you. So it's a challenging, I guess it's a challenging thing, and we're trying to push on that.
I just, one thing is, this issue in lots of ways is very complicated, but in another way it's very simple. Everybody knows about their property taxes and how high they are, and a lot of people know that they're a lot higher than their relatives pay in other states. And so I think a place to start is to get people asking tough questions of their legislators. What are you going to do about our property taxes? And then there can be a menu of different kinds of taxes, and depending on what rate you pick, it raises a certain amount of money. And the state government has the capacity to figure that out and develop that menu. The legislature, one of their first tasks should be develop that menu. Unfortunately, the commission that we talked about, they didn't develop that menu. They only looked at property taxes. They didn't look at anything else for the reasons that Zach said. The other thing, I tend to be sort of an optimist about this. New Hampshire population has changed a lot in the last 20 years. It's not the same people who heard ad infinitum about the New Hampshire Advantage and the pledge and all that stuff. There are a lot of younger people for whom that's ancient history. I also think our legislature is accessible. There are 400 of them. They're easy to get to. And my experience in talking to many of them over decades is if they hear from 10 people about an issue, that really gets their attention. It doesn't have to be sophisticated. You don't have to give them the PowerPoint. My property taxes are too high. The schools are struggling. What are you going to do about it? And they hear that from 10 people. That gets them going.
Yes, sir.
I'm David Erickson, and I spend a lot of time driving around town talking with youth in Ware, running for state rep. And I want to know whether the New Hampshire tax advantage is just for the wealthy, or is it for your average earner?
I mean, I guess one way to answer that is that we, in general, in New Hampshire, we have a pretty regressive tax system, which, by definition, that's not our numbers. Like it's by definition, the more you make, the less you pay in general. And so, there are ways of which to address that. There are, the interest and dividends tax, at least a good chunk of it was in general a tax paid by higher earners. We have a property tax relief program in this state, a currently existing program called the Low and Moderate Property Tax Relief Program. It paid out $1.3 million last year in total property tax relief in the whole state. That's an average amount of $250 per claim. That doesn't help anyone with their property taxes, right? So we have some of these mechanisms, we just don't always fund them all the time. Yes, sir.
Earlier on your presentation, you were saying that we pay here in New Hampshire among the highest rates of property tax. Was that just specifically talking about the school portion? And part two of that is that comparing us to other states that don't have state income tax and state sales tax? Or is that just across the board, all states?
So I'll clarify, we pay one of the highest proportions of our schools, like the amount of property, the percent of school funding that comes from property taxes is among the highest in this country.
And is that comparing us to
All states. Yeah.
So it's really not comparing apples to apples then? Because those other states, a lot of them have sales tax, state income tax that offsets that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's a.
We compare with states like ours that don't have state income tax and state sales tax.
Yeah, so we're still, for example, I think, so you look at 60% of our school revenue comes from property taxes, really 70 if you count swept. The next highest is 40%. I don't have the few states off the top of my head that, the few other states that also don't have an income and sales tax. Yeah, Yeah, but even amongst all other states, it's a 20% drop just to the next highest state.
I think if you look at those other states that are, as we are, don't have the state income tax, don't have the state sales tax, they also don't have the population, like Wyoming, where it's mostly sheep,
Yeah.
right? So, I don't like to say it, but if we want to get this down, we need to look at some kind of sales tax or some kind of state income tax.
And another way to think about that is, even just to keep it in the, the comfort realm for many people of just looking at a property tax. If we were to just do a true statewide property tax, right? So goes to the state, gets redistributed as was originally intended. There'd be ways to build in different property tax breaks, different exemptions, so that people, not towns, people who couldn't afford to pay more could get, say, a homestead exemption on the first $200,000 of their home. And the $2 tax rate that John talked about, that $2 tax rate could pay for the conval rulings. Some people in some communities would pay more, some would pay less. But there are ways in which even to make the property tax significantly more equitable than we currently have it.
When was the last time that proposal or something like it has been sort of like put out there in the flesh or out there in reality for people to look at and talk about?
Like a month ago. So there was so there was a bill even just this past year that would have had all swept money instead of being raised and retained locally, all of it go to the state to then get redistributed as was originally intended, and would have increased the low and moderate property tax relief program from $1.3 million to a maximum of $30 million a year. Jacked up increased the threshold so more people could apply. And that bill got effectively killed about a week before the court ruling came out because the legislative committee wanted to wait for the court ruling. So there's another bill next year that'll do a similar thing, but it is, again, kind of like come back to this in general sometimes, like if the legislative body that's dealing with these things doesn't feel a pressure or supported to acknowledge them, then they feel comfortable just being like, well, we'll just wait again.
So your question about the overall tax burdens is a really good one. New Hampshire, our overall tax burden as compared to many states is low. It's low. What we have is we have a totally out of whack tax portfolio where we rely so much on property taxes and so little on everything else. And we're just going through the exercise of showing you all how that, and I'm not even talking about economic policy or fiscal policy, how that's unfair to taxpayers and students. So
I think there's a way to bring about a sales tax that is more in line with a luxury sales tax. If you want the wealthy to start paying a little more, let's start taxing yachts. Let's start taxing properties in excess of $2 million. Let's start taxing luxuries. We don't have to put a sales tax on groceries. We all have
Right.
to buy groceries.
Right.
We don't have to put a sales tax on gas. We all need that. But there's a whole lot of crap that those wealthy people are spending money on that they're not paying a dime extra on.
And traditionally, I think to this legal report, Matt Goldie, working there, New Hampshire is really good in terms of the New Hampshire advantage about taxing tobacco, all the things that all of us deal with. Sin taxes and things that we all, right? We tax things like gasoline that we all access, but we don't tax things that we don't all have the ability to access. And I think that was the thing that stuck out for me the most in terms of the burden between the two different places, right? If I can afford to buy a home in a community with higher or equalized value, then I'm guaranteeing I would pay less over time.
yeah.
And if I can't afford that, I don't get that.
This is why that kind of sales tax is fair. Because I'm not paying, I'm not buying a yacht, I'm not
Right.
buying a $2 million home, but if you can afford that, you can afford to pay the extra tax on it.
And one of the few taxes we had, a tax we had that did just that, we just repealed. The interest and dividends.
Because people with millions of dollars paid off lobbyists to get in there and make sure they got their way.
And another stated reason was that some people felt that that an interest and dividends tax was technically an income tax. And so to be a yeah, I'm just I'm telling you what was stated. I don't, but
It's been the same thing for centuries. If you
Yeah.
got the money, you
Yeah.
make the rules.
yeah.
And the rest of us got to pay for it.
Yeah, and so a lot of what we try to do with this is not be too depressing, but be informative, and then engage with, because I'm paid to do this too. I happen to care very deeply about it, right? But I'm paid to do this. And so my voice has a pretty specific limit with policymakers, right? They might respect that I know sometimes what I'm talking about, right? But your voice matters a lot more to your reps than mine. And so,
We're celebrating 250 years of the Boston Tea Party.
yeah.
Maybe it's time for another Tea Party.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
So, with all this discussion, of all these smart people, solve this very complex problem, has anyone kind of had a paradigm shift, instead of funding districts and funding kids? Does that ever come up? That's what they're saying.
Yeah, so currently we fund the kids. Yeah.
Looking at each individual and not the district.
Yeah, so they're sending money based per pupil and then, to the districts. So it's,
Enrollment goes down, the state funding goes down. If it goes up, the state funding goes down.
yeah. And part of the, those other, if a student qualifies for free or reduced lunch, that's a measure of poverty, they're not sending the money for the lunch, right? They're sending the money because in general, students who come from poverty in general need a few more resources. But yeah, it very much does follow the students.
And as far as the luxury tax idea, that's great in theory. Rhode Island did it, everyone took their boats and registered in Maine. They kept on the coast of Maine.
They can't move their property to Maine.
And I think, part of the importance of this is again, what I was just saying is you all sharing these ideas with your reps is much more impactful and has a different degree of impact than me, right? We're a good resource. We try to put out good research, have good information. So we provide some service to that extent, but there is you engaging in a different way with state reps, with the state senators, opens a door for them to maybe say, okay, I'll listen, I'll consider some of these different options. You have-
Do you have any data on how many of our state legislators have seen your presentation?
The question was how many state legislators have seen our presentation. A good chunk. We try really hard to get, and so when after in the last election, we held a bunch of just briefings. So 800 people running for state rep. We partnered with some other organizations, like an affordable housing organization had just learn about education funding and affordable housing. Just here are the issues. A couple hundred of them attended. I'd say maybe half or so.
So you feel that they are getting themselves really well educated about this issue?
It's an opt-in. So some people, just like you all chose to be here tonight, and really appreciate you. We try to get our information out there and push it out as much as possible, but there is a degree of people need to want to learn it too. And that want comes from either feeling the pressure from talking to people in their town and having these questions directed at them, and then they're like, oh, I need to learn more about school funding. And or it just becoming, the court cases help. We've had people reach out after the court cases and say, hey, you guys talk about school funding, right? What the hell are these court cases?
Let me just say, I've been doing these presentations for more than 5 years, and a large number of, I've seen numbers of reps and a number of state senators, including some of the leaders. Jeb Bradley's come to several of these. Chuck Morris has come to several of these. A bunch of them. And my experience, it's really interesting as a citizen, is when they are in a community hall with their fellow citizens by themselves or not in a partisan environment, they're respectful, they listen, they seem to understand it, they realize it's a hard problem to solve, but they're usually not in denial about it. But then when they go back to Concord, the party pressures makes them just shut down about it. And so that's why the local pressure from people, the people they know, the constituents they care about, there are some legislators who are just pure ideologues and they don't care what they just trying to get elected, but most of them, whatever party, do care about this, and about not necessarily about this yet, but they care about what their constituents think. And if they hear from constituents about this enough, they start to pay attention, and then they start to go back to their caucus and say, you know, I'm hearing a lot about this. How about you? Are you hearing about it? Maybe we should do something about it. So the process is getting them to pay attention individually and then go back to their caucus and say, you know, maybe we should do, I'm hearing a lot about this in property taxes, maybe we should do something about it. And if the other person's heard that too, then they start to have a conversation. But it's just really important that they hear from you all, and they are gonna listen to you. And you don't have to have all the answers. And if they don't listen to you and they're rude to you, remember that, you know.
So maybe we'll do last question here, and then you know, we're happy to stay in chat, but I want to make sure folks can head out.
Sam, I live in Ware, the two kids that go to the Ware school here, it's great, we love it. Thanks for the presentation, it was awesome. Just a clarification, so from what I was able to take in, essentially the legislature of the state says that for an adequate education, the schools are required to do, they give a list, and then the local people have to pay for that. And then the courts told them, well, you need to pay too, but they won't do it. Is that correct? To a point?
Yes.
So, okay, so, you know, we talk about solutions, so essentially they're not complying.
Correct.
So if we have local control and they say, you know, you need to do this and you have to pay for it, is there, without hurting the schools or the students, depending on what it is why do we have to comply? Why don't we just say no?
I think part of the challenge is because in this specific arena, that would, you know, part of the not complying is not funding your schools.
Well, I mean, you could pick and
Yeah.
choose, but
Yeah.
there's certain things, I don't know, I'm just saying it seems to me like if you want to change something, they have all the leverage. The only leverage you or the community has is their collective, what's the word, compliance.
Yeah.
So is that, I don't know if that's there's perhaps a way you can maybe try to make, I don't know, leverage them to step up to their obligation.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and so like one other piece to that. So in other states, when there has been this back and forth where the judicial branch has said, you know, this is our interpretation of the laws of the Constitution, you legislature must do this, and legislature said no and gone back and forth. Sometimes courts will take more extreme measures. Like in Washington, they started fining the legislature $100,000 a day. The money went into a escrow account to be used for public education, but the point was like putting pressure on this needs to be solved, or putting a date. You know, like courts step into redistricting cases all the time, right? Either these are going to be the maps that you use if you don't solve them, or you have a certain amount of time. So there's more kind of teeth that can be had. The problem does come back to this delicate dance with separation of powers, and courts being very, very uneasy with stepping too far into here's how you spend your money or raise money. But I can tell you without a doubt that there would be a significant impact if everyone in this room called your rep tonight and said, hey, I went to this presentation and learned about school funding and property taxes, and these guys said, there's these court cases, like, what are you gonna do to comply? Like, that would make an impact. How big? But like, that absolutely would make an impact. It's a place to start.
All you want, but if they're paying with our money,
Yeah,
so what do they care?
yeah,
We're not finding them personally from their personal bank accounts. They don't give a hoot.
yeah. No, and that's part of a challenge also. Challenge and pros and
Taxation without representation.
yeah, and that's yeah.
No, they don't.
So,
thing is,
yeah, let's wrap up.
stay tuned in terms of the remedies that the court gets to be persuaded to impose on the government, on the state government, if they don't comply. This decision by this judge to pick a number before the court just stayed away from picking a number because they said that's a legislative function, it's not our job. But the state has punted that for 30 years. So he said, it's really your job, but I'm going to put this number out there now because you're so far off. And in other states, if they continue to not obey it, then it's shut the schools down or fine or put people in jail for contempt. And we're not there yet, but believe me, the lawyers are all thinking about that. But let me go back to his thing about the state standards. Most of the things that the state requires schools to do, you would agree with. Their health and safety and not having, making sure that the nurse is trained and that you don't have 100 kids in a classroom. They're really designed to help kids. The problem is not those rules, which I think we would all agree with if we sat down and read them. It's the state isn't paying for what it says you must do.
All right, so on that note, thank you so much for coming. We're happy to stay and answer questions, but thank you so much for having us here. Really appreciate it.